Thank you. Hello. When I hear myself introduced, I think, no wonder I'm so tired. That's a lot of stuff to do. We have 14 grandchildren, and this past Wednesday, 2 days ago, we spent the whole day at Dollywood in Tennessee, Dolly Parton's amusement park, with 10 of the 14 grandchildren. So it's another good reason for me to be tired. This is the right time of year to go to amusement parks because nobody's there. My son, Father Steve Matthews, rode all 10 of their roller coasters, many of them over and over because there were no lines. So I pass that on to you, parents and grandparents. Go in September. I was invited to speak, obviously, and I thought, what do I have to say? Because I'm not a manager. I don't have any organization. I don't have a value statement, or I don't have to figure out how to do a budget or manage people and make them do the right stuff. I don't know how to do any of that. I'm just me. I'm just a solitary freelance writer. But then I thought, well, maybe what I have that might be useful is that these days everybody has to be a writer. Everybody is expected to have some kind of an online presence, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, or maybe you even have a blog and you're actually writing essay-length pieces. Perhaps you have a podcast. There are all kinds of different ways you may be expected to contribute words to the blogosphere that's out there. So I thought, well, maybe I'll just tell you some things that I learned along the way about being a writer, about honing your attention, focusing on what's important to you, getting the work done, some pitfalls to avoid, and so forth. I'll start by sharing how I became a writer, because it's a very unusual career path that I followed. I guess I was about 12 when I started writing little poems at home, and my parents encouraged me, and my teachers, thank God, encouraged me. So I kept on writing all through high school. I was, editor of the little literary magazine, went off to college, continued writing poetry. At some point, though, I became interested in film, not filmmaking, but movie history, the silent movies, the early Hitchcock movies. I remember taking a course, it was titled German Film of the 1930s. I became very interested in film history because it's a brand new art form that never existed before. And people are able to do things in moving pictures that were never possible before in any other form of visual arts. So it fascinated me, and I wanted to write about it. And by the time I was in college, and some of you have heard my conversion story, which we'll weave in here. I had been a pious little Catholic girl at one point, but I outgrew that and I became very cynical. I didn't believe in God, or perhaps I believed in all the gods, like they're all ways to God are equal. It's all many pathways up the mountain, and had a lot of contempt, I would say, for Christian faith, and enjoyed skewering my Christian friends and trying to knock them down, trying to cause them to have doubts about Christ. So I was kind of hostile about all that. This was the early 70s, so it was still very much the hippie era, and my favorite magazine was The Village Voice. I read The Village Voice every week, and the movie reviewer was Andrew Saris, who I learned much, much later was a good Greek Orthodox boy himself. Andrew Saris, my goal was to replace him as the film critic for The Village Voice. I thought, he's probably old. Maybe I can take his place. But it was, once I graduated college, I realized that it was a lot harder to become a writer than I realized, because it wasn't obvious how you get into the business. It was like there was this walled castle. Inside the castle, people are writing and publishing books, articles, magazines. How do you get into the castle? I had no idea how to do that. And right at that point in my life, something changed dramatically. so that I put aside my dream of becoming a writer. My husband and I were married 1 week after I graduated college out in the woods. It was a genuine hippy-dippy wedding. We had a vegetarian reception. My wedding dress was unbleached muslin. We had in the procession, as we walked through the woods to the clearing, there was a black lab with a red bandana around its neck, was part of the procession. So we had very much this hippie wedding that we had designed. I was like a Mother Earth, hippie, feminist, spiritual seeker type of hippie. My husband, my boyfriend up until that point, was more of a political hippie. He was a contented atheist. It didn't bother him that there was no God. He was fine with that. So he was a little more political. I was a little more wistful and dreamy. But we got married and went to Europe, and we were hitchhiking around Europe for several months. And some of you have heard my story more than once. I believe at some point I'll look up and I'll see people lip syncing as I tell this. But we arrived in Dublin on June 20th, 1974, in the afternoon and put down our backpacks at a bed and breakfast and went out to see if there were any museums or historical sites or anything still open at that time of the day. And there was a church. As we walked along, we found a church that was open and went in and just wandering around inside. As I went toward the main altar, I saw there was a smaller altar on the side. And I walked up to it. There was a statue of Jesus, a white marble statue. If you're familiar with it, it's what the Catholics call the Sacred Heart, where Jesus is pointing to his heart, and you can see his heart exposed on his chest, the crown of thorns wrapped around it, and flames coming out of the top. This was a way he appeared to a Belgian nun in the 18th century. And he said to her, "Behold the heart that has so loved mankind." So I was standing there just looking at this statue, and then I realized that I had fallen to my knees, and I could hear a voice speaking to me. It wasn't a voice that I heard with my ears. It was interior. It was, the image I came up with later was, it was like there was a radio in my heart, and I never knew it was there. And at that moment, it snapped on, and this voice was filling my awareness. And the voice said, "I am your life. I am your life. You think your life is your history, your personality, the fact that you're alive, that your heart beats. That is not your life. I am your life. I am the foundation of everything else in your life." Well, that was 45 years ago. One of the effects of that was it made me, I thought later, this must be what heroin is like. Because I felt so addicted to Jesus Christ. I felt like I would walk through fire for him. I just want to be near him. And perhaps that's sort of what happened to St. Paul, that he got the fire inside that just drives you. You want more and more of Jesus Christ, and more to help other people know him. And this has been my deepest and strongest desire ever since, is to bring other people to Jesus Christ. Well, I had finished college. I didn't know how to start being a writer. All of a sudden, I was a Christian. My husband was on his own separate path. Before we got married, he was taking a course, sociology, philosophy of religion, and the professor required everybody to read one of the Gospels. So he found a Bible, and he noticed that there were 4 Gospels, and he noticed that Mark was the shortest. So he started reading Mark. We hadn't been dating very long then, and I remember how alarmed I was, because he kept saying, there's something so compelling about Jesus. There's something, he speaks with authority, he said, almost as if he was quoting the Gospel of Mark. He speaks with authority. what he says is true. Jesus seems to think that there really is a God. So I'm going to have to rethink my atheism. And I was like, no, wait, stop. You're not going to become a Jesus freak, are you? And so it was like a race where he was ahead and I was ahead and he was ahead. Finally, we came together, and he had been raised Episcopalian. And so he decided that he wanted to go on studying about Jesus. And graduate school, if you want to learn about Jesus, it's called seminary. He had no intention of being a pastor, but he started going to the Episcopal Seminary in Alexandria, Virginia. And my first day on campus, somebody said, well, why don't you go to seminary too? I thought, okay. So I started attending classes. I didn't take my GRE till November. The faculty looked back at it and wondered how the heck that happened. But at any rate, he and I both went to seminary. I was hoping to become a female priest. That's so redundant, isn't it? I was already female. I wasn't hoping to become female. I was already female. I was hoping to become a priest. We thought that the two of us could be like a team, and we would each do half the job of being a pastor. But women's ordination was still so new then, we couldn't find an Episcopal bishop that was willing to ordain both of us. So we decided my husband would go ahead. I was pregnant by that point. He will get a job at some point in the future. We'll go back and I'll be ordained. But after I'd seen what the life of a pastor is for a few years, I decided I didn't want to do that. It's a very hard job, and it wasn't the job I felt cut out for. So we were very happy. He was a pastor, we had 3 kids. I was teaching natural childbirth classes. I was teaching Bible studies. Everything was going along just fine, and probably would have remained that way, and I never would have become a writer, except for this next thing that happened. We were still very cool, hippie-type people, and our politics was quite left-wing, always had been. I had been quite the feminist in college and, of course, supported abortion rights. And just to wrap this part up really quickly, I read an article in Esquire magazine that described an abortion, and it made me realize that it was an act of violence. And I had been so anti-war, anti-death penalty, vegetarian, like in every way, there is never a need for violence. You can solve problems without violence. And I was convicted that I had accepted an act of violence at the center of my feminism. So that was disturbing, but I still had, we both felt so superior to conservatives and to moral conservatives and social conservatives. Didn't want anything to do with pro-lifers because, you know, they had cooties or something. But I discovered there was a group called Feminists for Life. Feminists for Life. And it was founded by some members of NOW, National Organization of Women, who had been expelled from their local chapter because they opposed abortion. So they started this little organization. I was delighted. I became a member. I was getting the little quarterly newsletter. Here's where my life changed. April 1989, the newsletter said, we need a new editor. The editor is going to do something else. So I volunteered to be the editor. Then I found out that made me a vice president of the organization. Then I found out that I was the only person on the board who lived near a major media center. We lived just south of Washington, D.C. So even before I'd brought out my first issue of this little tiny mimeograph, many of you are like, what, mimeograph? I never heard that word. People my age remember mimeographs. It had a distribution of 2,000 people. It was so dinky. It was mimeograph, 16 pages. Before I brought out the first issue, that summer, 1989, a Supreme Court decision, the Webster decision, came down. So I'm getting phone calls from the other members of the board who are in places like Kansas City, Sarasota, Florida, saying, go down to the Supreme Court, get there, try to get on TV. And I was very nervous, but you know, they were very insistent. So I went down and I tried to get on TV, and I ended up meeting some other leaders of the pro-life movement, and things started to happen very fast after that. Right away, I was invited to be on PrimeTime Live. So I was on the show PrimeTime Live debating a pro-choice actress in Hollywood. And it seemed like what I was able to do, they liked it. And I think also it was a new thing to talk about that the media and the American people had just gotten so tired of this issue. The concept that there could be feminists for life was like, wow, you know, man bites dog. It was a new thing. So I was on C-SPAN, CNN, ABC, NBC. I was on NPR a lot. I was a regular commentator on NPR, both Morning Edition and All Things Considered for several years. Many, many different magazines and newspapers and radio and TV. And it was brand new to me, you know, it was really kind of a shock. But they kept pushing me in front of the cameras, and I felt relaxed there. For some reason, I didn't feel nervous, you know, I felt okay, and I would just talk. Maybe what I was doing different was that people kept trying to do media training for me and telling me you have to have your bullet points and you have to keep shoving them in there. No matter what the host of the show says, no matter what your debate partner says, you just keep repeating your bullet points. And I thought that would be boring, you know? I wouldn't want to see that. What I want to see is a really good conversation between people that disagree. I want to eavesdrop on that conversation. So that's what I always tried to do. I tried to create a good conversation that would be interesting to eavesdrop on. The first thing I ever wrote that was published was an essay titled The Bitter Price of Choice. Bitter Price of Choice, which was recommended reading. I don't know if anybody got around to reading it in the pre-reading that was sent out a couple of months ago. And that was published, it was distributed kind of all over the country, and newspapers picked it up, and then immediately people are contacting me saying, I want to reprint it. Can I reprint this? Can I reprint it here? I ran into somebody who said, I just keep stacks of it photocopied, and whenever I see a pro-choice bumper sticker, I stick it under the windshield. I thought, man, I'm irritating people without even knowing I'm doing it. And what I found was there was kind of a cycle here that when I wrote things, people would contact me and they would say, I want to interview you for my publication. Or they'd say, I want you to come give a speech. Or they'd say, I want you to write something, the same stuff, but change the words around so it's new. You know, like use totally new words to say the same thing. That was kind of frustrating to me. But I ended up writing a great deal about pro-life feminism over those early years. And I meant to bring my printout of my Vita with me, just because when you see it, it's like, man, how did she do this? 10 books at this point, 612 speaking events, hey, 613. 797 essays and 753 media interviews. Beginning way back when you had to, you know, if I wrote something, I would get in the car, I would drive to the business supply store, and they would FedEx it to the publisher, you know, and then we'd have to edit it over the phone, which was really hard. I've been through a lot of different technology. I wrote my first book on a I-286 computer. Yeah, some of you are maybe old enough to remember that, with amber lettering on a black screen. I've seen a lot. My brain is so filled with obsolete technology that I don't need to remember anymore. If I say, what did AOL sound like when you were dialing up? You know, many of you over a certain age, you can do that. Ew. So, a major turning point for me in all this is all 1989. I was 37 years old. My youngest was in second grade. I was invited to go to a meeting of all the leaders of all the pro-life organizations. It was all these people that I had seen on TV or heard their names or I'd read their book or something. And it was just astonishing to me that I was going to be allowed to be in a room with them. So that was in Washington, D.C., and they put me up in the hotel the night before. In the morning of the meeting, I knelt down beside the bed, and I prayed. I just felt like this is the beginning of a real change in your life. Things are going to take off here. And I just prayed that the Lord would guide me and that I would always serve him, that I would always find opportunities to lead people to him, even though I was representing a very secular pro-life organization. And I had a picture came to mind. It was a glass book, and that's the reason for my title. I saw a book that was made out of, the pages were just like panes of glass. And it was beautiful, it was lovely. The edges were polished. It was that slightly blue, greenish, kind of aqua colored, nice thick pages, and buffed on the edges. And I could turn the pages. It was just a beautiful object to hold. And then when it closed, I could see all the way through it. It was clear. I could see all the way through. There was no distortion. There was nothing in the way. There was nothing false. There was nothing unnecessary. And I thought, that's how my life needs to be, so that no matter what I do, that I will always be transparent like that book is, that I will always be consistent with myself and with the things I value most, that I will always be drawing people to Jesus Christ more than anything else, trying to persuade them of this opinion or that opinion. That became kind of the bench line for me, is to always be prioritizing the transparency and the lordship of Jesus Christ as the most important thing that I was doing. So I became a professional writer without intending to, getting many invitations to write, and then writing a book, and then another, and another book. We were still Episcopalian then. We became Orthodox in 1993. So my first few years of writing and doing all this media work and everything, we were still Episcopalian then. I got some advice as I was beginning to be a writer, so I wanted to pass this on to you for the little bits of writing maybe you have to do. It was not all good advice. I'll give you a couple that I think were not really very good advice. The first was, somebody said to me very seriously, you're beginning your career as a pro-life speaker, specialize in something. Mark out your little territory and just make that your own. He said, I've seen people come and go, and if you try to be a generalist, if you try to cover everything about the topic, you just fade away. You need to stake out your territory and stick to that. And I didn't do that at all. I found that as I was writing, I guess at first it was a lot of opinion pieces about the issue and the organization I represented. But then somebody said, well, would you review this book? Well, would you review this movie? Oh, that's what I always wanted to do, review movies. And then I had an idea for a little piece I wanted to write that was kind of humorous. And the editor said, sure, yeah, send us anything like this. We'll always be happy to see it. So I started just writing about anything I was interested in. When I had a column with Religion News Service, a bi-weekly column, I asked the editor, what do you want me to focus on? What am I to write about? And she said, anything that interests you. Write about anything that interests you. So I got to write about all kinds of things, being a mom, and I had this weird dream, and just anything that came to mind. So, don't be a generalist, be a specialist. That was the urgent advice I was giving, and that I didn't follow. I managed to remain a generalist, and it turned out okay. But I think that it's good for you as a writer to think about what does interest you the most. What are the things that you want to learn more about? What are the things that are worth studying? So if you're going to write about it, you'll be able to do so from a position of being at least well informed. Deciding for yourself are there borders around your garden? You can't exhaust yourself, you'll be no good to anyone else. So think about what you want to specialize in. There certainly are kinds of writing. I never wrote any science fiction. There's plenty of writing I never did, and I don't intend to do. So think about that. Don't be a generalist, be a specialist. How does that apply to you? How can you conserve your energy and your attention? So we live in this attention economy. to do the best things, to produce the best kind of writing that you can do. Second, another thing I read it was advice to authors of books. And the advice was, a book is a tomato. A book is a tomato. And what they meant was, you have to keep putting out a new book every year or two. And it can say exactly the stuff the previous book did. But your fans, if they see your book and they see it's a couple of years old, they won't buy it. They need to have the same book repackaged with a different cover and a different title, but basically saying the same stuff. A book is a tomato. It looks like it goes bad after a couple of years. So keep reformatting the same stuff you're always saying. I disagreed with that. I really didn't like that. I know I would not be able to write if I wasn't always discovering more new and interesting things to write about. I think that's human nature. You'd have to be awfully cold-blooded, I think, to just keep putting out the same ideas over and over again. So I think that you should always be seeking new material. In a way, being a writer is being a teacher. If you're a writer, if you're a speaker, if you're just putting out a Twitter every once in a while, a tweet. I have never been on Twitter. So I set up my Facebook, so I think it goes to Twitter. I don't check on it, I don't know. But even that, in that tiny format, find original things to say, to think about, to talk about. Always be seeking new material. You think about your favorite teacher. Was there a teacher that you really loved in high school or in college that got you excited about a topic, so you wanted to learn more about it? The reason the teacher engaged you that way was because the teacher was enthusiastic. The teacher was interested in the things that he or she was teaching. Passionate, engaged, invested in this material. So do that. Think about what inspires and excites you. That's what you should be writing about. You're going to automatically make that interesting to other people. A little practical hint for this is something that many writers keep is a file folder they call the tickler file. It tickles your imagination. Keep a file folder where you just put in ideas. You may not be interested enough to do the research into this topic now. You may not have the time for it, but just scribble it on a piece of paper and stick it in the folder. Sometime when you need to write something but you don't have any ideas, go through your tickler folder and see what ideas are there. A corresponding idea to that, something I do is I've got a folder for every month of the year, so that if I have a great idea for writing about St. Thomas on Thomas Sunday, or the week leading up to Thomas Sunday, Bright Week, but it's October, I write that down and I put it in the March or the April folder. So when I'm coming around that time of year, I'll remember that I had this great idea. So a tickler folder, and now 12 more folders, one for each month of the year, and just keep stuffing things in there. So you might have stuff in there that is there for 10 years and you just never get around to writing it. But keep it in there as long as it seems to you worth doing. When you come around to April, you open it up, you look through that, you say, I'll do this one this year, I'm going to keep that one for another year. All of those things are useful to you, these little ideas to keep you working. And one more piece of advice that I think is good advice. It was something that I noticed when I was very involved in the pro-life cause, was there seemed to be people who were proclaimers and there were people who were persuaders. There were proclaimers and persuaders in any kind of persuasive writing or any kind of combative writing. You're either a persuader or a proclaimer. Think about which you are, which works better for you, which fits your heart a little bit better. Do you write to express yourself, or do you write to communicate? If you just want to express yourself, you can write it and put it in a box and put the box under your bed. If you want to communicate, I think that's the higher calling, and that involves a whole lot more subtlety. So I've got the 5-minute warning The point about the glass book was you've got to retain a strong prayer life, a strong sense of connection to God. Whatever you do, do it with integrity. Do it with your whole heart. Do it with complete sincerity. If you start selling out on that, you can't find yourself again. You lose yourself. You've got to be completely committed to the truth of what you're doing. If you are, it draws people like your favorite teacher drew you because of her enthusiasm. And I didn't get to talking about the scripture reading that I gave you about this beautiful story about Elisha and Naaman, the Syrian who had leprosy. And this was a little girl who had been kidnapped on a raid as the Syrians went into Palestine. They kidnapped this little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, and now she's a slave. And she waits on Naaman's wife. Naaman is a leper, and the little girl said, oh, if only he was able to go to Elisha the prophet. If only he could go to the prophet that is in Israel, he would take away this leprosy. So Naaman went to the king. The king said, yes, that's fine. He gave him all these gifts, sent it ahead of him to the king of Israel with a letter saying, I'm coming to you so you can cure my leprosy. It's kind of a funny story. It's beautifully told. So the king of Israel's tearing his garments and saying, I don't know how to cure somebody of leprosy. He's trying to pick a fight with me. He wants to go to war against me. It's a plot. That's what this is. But Elisha heard about it, and Elisha said, just send him to me. And of course, there is a healing. It's a delightful story. The thing I was going to point to was that little girl. That I think we are coming into a time when life is going to be harder on Christians, where the things that we believe so deeply and so passionately will be mocked. Isn't it right that that happened to me? I mean, think about how I mocked and made fun of Christians when I was a teenager, and how I was a blasphemer. I insulted the God that they loved, maybe the God that you loved if you never had a wilderness wandering time like I did. There's no reason you should forgive me. There's no reason you should forgive me for that. I was pretty terrible to Christians. Well, perhaps that's coming full circle, because it seems like there's more and more impatience, especially with traditional Christian morality, which I believe I have to stand up for, no matter how unpopular or unacceptable it is. That little girl who was kidnapped, who was a slave in the home of Naaman the Syrian. God is going to place us all over the place. There's a little girl, there's a Christian housekeeper in the home of a movie star right now. And one day when that movie star is weeping at her kitchen table, the housekeeper will be able to say, can I show you something in the scriptures? God is going to put us at all these different places where we can be influential when we just witness wholeheartedly, easily, readily, witness to our faith. It's not a time for gathering power. It's not a time for making big, $1 million advertisements on TV. It's a time when we're going to be reduced and broken, but we will have our stories. We will have our faith that we can talk about. So since I only got about halfway through my talk, that's the thing I want to encourage you to do, is to think about a time when you experienced the presence of God. Maybe it's not a story like my conversion story. That's a heck of a story. But I've had a lot of other smaller stories through the years. I wrenched my neck. This was before I was really a believer. And I went to the doctor, and he said, it's going to be 2 or 3 weeks for this muscle to fully relax. And a friend of mine in the seminary class put her hand on my shoulder, prayed for me, and I was immediately healed. I've got a lot of stories like that, and you do too. You might think, oh, I'm the kind of person that doesn't happen to. You're not. Stuff like that happens to you. But because you think you're not that kind of person, you forget these stories. Doesn't the Old Testament say over and over, remember Israel, remember the great works of God? I want to urge you to think back over your life. Think about every time God has done a mighty work in your life, or even just a little work in your life, because people need to hear these stories. The hunger for the supernatural, the curiosity about ghosts, about going through ghost stories, haunted houses, the curiosity about exorcism. There's so much supernatural, spiritual hunger out there. The hunger is there. We just need to be ready to tell our stories at a moment when the movie star is weeping and you're the housekeeper. You've got to be ready to tell your story when the time comes. So I encourage you to think about a story like that in your life. Think about how you would tell that story just to a friend, not somebody you're nervous about. Then tell it to your friends. Keep working on it. You'll find more and more stories come to mind. Build up a repertoire of these stories. Get comfortable telling them. Have peace, have tranquility in the Lord. Be confident that He can bring around the right moment. I have certainly had times in my life when I witnessed to somebody and they just scoffed at me. And then a year later, 2 years later, they come to the Lord. So don't think that you failed. There are many times somebody walks away, you think, well, I didn't get anywhere with her. And you don't even know later in her life she came to the Lord. We don't always know. God, what is it? One waters, one plants, God gives the increase. That was the thing I wanted to say to you, just to think about that little girl. She had nothing. She was probably illiterate. She'd been stolen from her mother and her father. She was in a foreign land. She was a slave. And yet she was able to say, if only Naaman was in the land of the prophet could heal him. It's a wonderful story. So you have your wonderful stories too. You don't have to be a professional writer to tell them. Just prepare, be ready when the time comes that you can tell that story to others. So thank you for that. Thank you. By your prayers.
Thank you, Frederica.
Sure.
One of the things to me that makes your writing so special and interesting is you seem to have these, you do have these unique insights. And you have a way also of setting out something that is maybe obvious to some people and making it so clear, but what we didn't see before. So you're such a great writer, so I'm a big fan. But
Thank
what
you.
about the rest of us? We do need to write. Do you have any inspiration if we just aren't people of inspiration or insight like you are? Any coaching on that?
Yes, on how to become a writer. I do think that even if you're not an eloquent writer, if you don't have a great command of words, just sincerity shines through. Even if you're stumbling in your words, that the sincerity and the urgency, that has a way of breaking through to people, whereas real eloquence might be off-putting or might sound too polished or unreal, like people don't really talk that way. I would always prioritize prayer, asking the Lord to guide your words. I think when I started writing, and especially my first book, my book before, Facing East, it was overwritten. I was trying so hard to have it be witty and clever and polished, and I think that drew away from it in the long run. I think I've become simpler and simpler as the years have gone by. The way you will tell your story is so unique. It'll be different from anyone else in the world in history. I like to think about our membership in the church as being like every person is a glass lantern, and every one of us is a slightly different color, just a different shade. And when we shine out, it's the light of Christ inside each of us. That's the same. But the color of the glass that you can bring, no one else in all of history has exactly that shade. So be yourself. Don't be afraid to be yourself. And if there's any lesson I've learned, it's that more simplicity, more humility, not trying to be impressive, not trying to twist their arms, letting the results be up to the Lord rather than trying to grab those results for yourself. I think all of those things work. It certainly is, compared to when I started writing, much more casual forms of expression, much more casual writing has become acceptable than it used to be. So that's very democratizing. It means anybody can be a writer now. So, thank you.
Frederica, you've done a great job being able to have a dialogue with groups of people that have divergent points of view from your own and having really respectful dialogue with them. I mean, what feedback or advice would you have for the rest of us who are working with others and having to be with others who may have views that are divergently opposite from our own and have to kind of go to work and be in those environments on a day-to-day basis?
Boy, that's a good question, and some of us are fortunate enough that we're in a little environment where we're pretty protected from the storms of the culture that are going on. And some of you do have to go to work every day in an environment where people disagree vehemently with you and with certain of your beliefs. I think the thing that helps me is always thinking that this question or this problem or this issue does not exist theoretically. It doesn't. The theoretical fog of this idea, it really doesn't have any real existence. What has existence is a real human being who is under the influence of those thoughts. And every single human being is loved by the Lord, and the Lord is trying to draw them to himself and using a million things we don't see. Their guardian angel is next to them. This person who may be saying very hateful things to you and who looks like their mind is so barricaded that nothing will ever get in. And yet God can get them surrounded. They can be standing in line at the post office and the person in front of them is talking about a scripture. You know, it could be anything. It could be she hears a song that reminds her of when she was in Sunday school 40 years ago. It could be anything. And often it's a lot of things all at once. It's coming from all different directions. God can reach them through dreams, through things they overhear, as I said, through things they happen to read. Remember that person is in the hands of God, and he cares so much more about them than you do. Even if it's a family member that you're having a disagreement with, God loves them more than you do. God desires their salvation even more than you do. And putting your trust in that, instead of aiming at changing them, aiming at just being God's servant in the situation to say whatever you're supposed to say in order to lead things to the result that God is working toward. I like to say that if you feel a terrible burden for someone and you find that you're thinking, well, it's Thanksgiving, is coming and I'm going to sit at the table, and should I challenge them about this belief they have, or should I try to make a point, or should I try to convince them? I think if it feels like a burden, then it's not your job, because the Lord said, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. So if you feel a terrible weight, like it's your responsibility to change somebody's thinking, just let that go, because God is completely able to get at them from a million other directions. If God is calling you to do or to say something, you won't be able to escape that knowledge. He will keep coming at you over and over and insisting, you've got to stand up and you've got to say this. But short of that, just keep loving them. I can tell a story now about what happened in my own life and in my own family. We hadn't said anything about this, my husband and I, but we feel like we're about ready to start talking about it. Our youngest child, Stephen, is a priest. He's pastor of a Greek Orthodox Church. Our middle son, our middle child, David, is now a subdeacon. He was ordained a subdeacon at the beginning of June. At the end of June, my husband and I drove to Frederick, Maryland, and went to the Unitarian Church there for a service that afternoon. In that service, our daughter Megan, our firstborn child, my baby, was ordained a Unitarian pastor. She was there with her wife, Nikki. She had left her husband some years ago and married Nikki and gone to seminary and become a Unitarian pastor and was called to a church outside of Cleveland. There's been a lot of pain in this, for us, but I gotta say something about Megan, just about her, that she's just brilliant at managing relationships. She has made this as easy for us as it could be. She said to me and my husband, her dad, I know that we believe incompatible things. I know that we believe incompatible things. And that made us both feel so liberated. We didn't have to feel like, am I violating my own standards? Am I violating my own integrity just from being at a restaurant with her? You no longer had to worry about that. She knows everything we believe. She grew up in a house with us. She knows all of our belief and what Orthodoxy teaches. And we understand the things that she believes that are incompatible with what we believe. And we love her so much, and we love Nikki. I was, for some time, she wouldn't speak to us for a number of years. I kept trying to find ways to reach her, and I kept thinking, if I saw them, what would I say? I kept trying to think of ways to reach out, and I would try to talk to my husband about this. And he said, well, do you mean you could actually hug Nikki? And I said, I don't know. I don't know if I could. I think I could shake her hand. And, shortly before we moved a year ago, Megan and Nikki came in the house and my husband hugged Nikki. So it can be done, We love them and they love us, and we believe incompatible things. Yeah, I guess that's what I wanted to say about that. I'm kind of getting choked up talking about it. Hope springs eternal, The Lord is still in charge. I love her so much, and there's so much I am proud of. It's not the kind of situation you had in mind, because you're thinking more like workplace. I think that's a lot harder, especially when your workplace is going to require you to either affirm something or stay silent, and you don't even have the right to say, I believe incompatible things, if that's not permitted for you to say. I'm glad I'm not in that boat. I sometimes say, I'm glad I'm old. I think I'm not going to have to see the worst of this. God bless you and strengthen you. I will conclude. I know we've got to get out of here. I had a friend who was an Anglican bishop of Uganda. And he used to come to America. He was, we were still Episcopalian then, and we knew him. And one time he brought his wife, Harriet, and we picked them up at the train station. And we said, let's get something to eat. It's time for lunch. We pulled into KFC. And he turned around to his wife and he said, Harriet, look at this. You will see, this is how you get food in America. You scream into a box, and somebody hands you food out of a window. One of the things he said that always remained with me was, he said, before Idi Amin, we were like Christians everywhere. We had arguments in the church, there was backbiting, there was gossip. It was like anywhere else. When Idi Amin came to power and our lives were threatened and some of us were dying for our faith, God poured out on us love for each other. Maybe we didn't need it until that moment, but when the time came that we needed it, our relationships with each other totally were transformed. We had so much love for each other, and that gave us the courage to get through those terrible years. He said that, oh gosh, I just lost the tail of what I was going to say. It was a couple of years after that, the seminary asked, what can we send you in Uganda? What can you use? Thinking, maybe they need clothing or food or, the fuel to heat their stoves or something like this. And he said, we need clergy shirts. We need you to send us black shirts with white Anglican collars. And the seminary said, how can that possibly be the most important thing that you need? And he said, it's because when our people are being led out to be executed, they can see that their clergy are among them. So God gave them the strength for that when they needed the strength, when the time came. And he can give us the strength as well. Is there anything else? Or yes, I see Mother Emiliani in the back.
Just so grateful for the whole day and for this. And
wait 1 second for the
Oh, yeah.
I'm so grateful for the whole day and for this. And what comes to mind is Father Sojourner, Elder Sojourner in Essex, saying that if the Holy Spirit does not speak in the heart of someone, the holy apostles can be in front of him and he will throw stones at them. So what that means to me is, let us intensify our prayer, because only the Holy Spirit can do that, and be ready for the stones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Every conversion is an inside job. It has to be the Holy Spirit already in there, opening, softening, sometimes with a great deal of struggle. So, yeah, the prayer is our real source of strength. May God prepare us for everything that lies ahead. And my prayers are for you and yours are for me, I know. Let us keep each other in prayer. Thanks be to God. Thank you, dear.